So I want you to just picture this scenario for a second. It is a Wednesday afternoon.
Oh boy, the middle of the week slump.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're sitting in one of those, glass-walled conference rooms. The fluorescent lights are doing that humming thing, that low, brain-numbing artificial buzz.
I can hear it right now. It's awful.
Right. And you are just utterly exhausted. But you're pushing through because you're presenting a project that you have poured your absolute soul into for the last 3, maybe 4 months.
You're at the finish line.
You are quite literally at the finish line. The final slide is up. And then it happens. A coworker, somebody you usually get along with just fine, by the way, leans back in their ergonomic chair, swirls their iced coffee, and just casually, almost effortlessly, drops a passive-aggressive comment.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And this comment just completely and structurally undermines your entire premise, right in front of the whole executive team.
It is honestly a universally devastating moment. You can feel the exact millisecond the oxygen completely evacuates the room. The silence is just incredibly loud.
The silence is absolutely deafening. And instinctively, before your conscious, rational brain can even boot up to assess the situation, you snap back.
You go right on the attack.
Yeah, you drop a highly sarcastic, intensely defensive comment that hits them right between the eyes. You go straight for the jugular. And now the room goes ice cold.
Naturally.
The meeting, which was going, perfectly well 5 minutes ago, completely derails. And as you're packing up your laptop in that awful, suffocating atmosphere, the adrenaline starts to fade.
And that pit forms in your stomach.
Yes. You realize that you now have to spend the next 3 weeks doing intense damage control, writing groveling apology emails, and attempting to repair a critical professional relationship that you just enthusiastically nuked in 5 seconds.
Which, it forces a very uncomfortable question.
It really does. Why did you do that? I mean, you didn't walk into that boardroom with a premeditated plan to sabotage your entire week.
No, of course not.
You didn't sit down before the meeting, consciously weigh the pros and cons, and decide that, detonating your professional reputation was the most strategic move.
You didn't do any of that. Because the highly unsettling truth is that in that specific microscopic moment, you actually weren't thinking at all.
Wow.
Yeah, your conscious mind was entirely bypassed. Your biology made the choice for you.
And that right there is the core mystery we are unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are going on this really cinematic journey into the hidden war happening inside our minds during these seemingly insignificant, perfectly ordinary moments.
It's a fascinating area to explore.
It really is. And we have a massive stack of sources on the table today. We're pulling from cognitive psychology papers, behavioral economics research, evolutionary biology texts, and some really elite executive coaching frameworks.
Lots of ground to cover.
Definitely. Our mission is to synthesize all of this to understand exactly how our most primal, ancient instincts hijack our modern judgment. We're going to break down how the world's most effective, clear-thinking people engineer this invisible space to outposition these biological traps.
Because that space is everything.
Exactly. Ultimately, we're exploring how mastering that tiny gap between a stimulus and your response is sort of the ultimate cheat code to living a deeply effective life without constant regrets.
The scale of this hidden battlefield is what I find most compelling. We are walking around constantly under attack from our own evolutionary wiring.
We really are.
And the tragedy is, most of us don't even realize a skirmish is happening until the smoke clears and we're staring at the wreckage of our own choices.
Which is so true, because we spend an absurd amount of time and mental energy agonizing over the macro decisions, don't we?
Absolutely.
We build massive spreadsheets to decide who to marry, or whether to take that risky startup job across the country, or what neighborhood to buy a house in.
The big cinematic choices.
Right. But when you look at the research, it's actually the accumulation of these tiny, unthinking, completely ordinary micro moments. The snapped comment, the ignored email, the defensive posture, the choice to just hit snooze.
Yeah, those are the things that actually compound.
Exactly. Those invisible moments dictate whether our lives feel incredibly difficult or beautifully easy.
The trajectory of a human life is rarely determined by one cinematic, dramatic leap off a cliff. I mean, it is shaped by tens of thousands of microscopic daily course corrections.
So true.
And to understand why we continually self-sabotage in those ordinary moments, we really have to recognize the nature of the enemy. We have to move past the surface symptom, which is, that terrible sarcastic reaction in the meeting and diagnose the root cause.
Okay, so what is that root cause?
The root cause is that we are operating on a biological operating system that was designed for an environment that literally no longer exists.
I want to dig into this operating system concept. Because, when I do something I immediately regret, like snapping at a colleague, or, let's be honest, eating a whole row of cookies when I'm stressed, it genuinely feels like my software is glitching.
Yeah.
It feels like a complete system failure.
Well, the irony there is that it's not a glitched at all. It is actually a highly optimized feature.
A feature.
Yes, but it's a feature optimized for prehistoric survival, not corporate synergy. Let's look at the mechanics of conscious processing. Actually engaging your prefrontal cortex to think through a complex problem rationally requires a massive amount of caloric energy and time.
Which, historically, we didn't always have.
Exactly. In the prehistoric world, time and calories were the two most scarce resources. If a predator leaped out of the brush, the early human who paused to rationally analyze the animal's speed, trajectory, and emotional state, well, that was the human who got removed from the gene pool.
Right, they got eaten.
They got eaten. So evolution aggressively favored those who relied on rapid, low-energy stimulus response shortcuts. You perceive a threat, you react instantly without thinking.
Okay, right, that's the classic fight or flight response, the amygdala hijack.
Exactly. And here's where the mismatch occurs. Your primitive animal brain, particularly the amygdala, is incredibly fast, but it is terribly imprecise.
You mean what, exactly?
Meaning it does not easily distinguish between a literal physical threat to your life and a purely psychological threat to your identity.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So when your coworker undermines your slide deck, your brain processes that data not as a minor professional hurdle, but as a literal threat to your status within the tribe.
And in prehistoric times, losing status meant exile.
And exile meant starvation. So when that comment hits your ears, you immediately regress to a primal survival mode. You prioritize immediate self-preservation over long-term logic. You aren't trying to find the optimal business outcome anymore. Your biology is just trying to survive an attack.
It is wild to think about that. I mean, I'm sitting in a climate-controlled room, in an ergonomic mesh chair, sipping an artisanal iced latte, but my internal neurochemistry genuinely believes I am on the African savanna fighting for my life against a rival tribe member.
That is the precise physiological reality. And the cognitive psychology and behavioral economic sources we are examining today, they identify 4 very specific biological traps.
The defaults.
Right, we can refer to them as our defaults. These are the 4 deeply ingrained programs that just seize control of our minds in these high-pressure micro moments. The first one is the emotion default.
Let's pull that apart. Emotion is obvious, but how does it function as a default trap?
The emotion default is our hardwired tendency to respond to feelings rather than reasons, facts, or data.
Okay.
When you are fully possessed by the emotion of a moment, whether that is blinding anger, intense fear, or even overwhelming euphoria, all the sophisticated reasoning tools in your prefrontal cortex are rendered utterly useless.
Because of the adrenaline.
Yes. The biological cascade of cortisol and adrenaline essentially shuts down the rational brain. And the real danger here isn't just that you make a bad choice, it's that you don't even realize you are in a situation that requires thinking.
The emotion completely obscures the choice.
Exactly.
Man, I know that feeling intimately. It's like a red mist descends over your vision, and it feels entirely justified in the moment, you know? You aren't aware you had a choice until the anger metabolizes and passes, and then you're just left looking at the damage.
Furthermore, emotions rarely act alone. They have powerful accomplices.
Like what?
Our baseline biological vulnerabilities leave us incredibly exposed to this emotion default. If you are operating on sleep deprivation, if your blood sugar is crashing from hunger, if you are experiencing baseline fatigue, or if you are simply stressed from feeling constantly rushed, all of these states strip away your cognitive defenses.
Oh, for sure.
When you are tired and hungry, the emotion default is almost certainly running the show, and logic just doesn't stand a chance.
Which perfectly explains why I am, far more likely to pick a fight with my partner at 8 p.m. when I'm starving, compared to 10 a.m. on a Saturday after a full breakfast.
The biological defenses are completely down.
Okay, so if emotion is the first trap, where does the biology steer us next?
That brings us directly to the ego default. This mechanism triggers whenever we encounter anything that threatens our sense of self-worth, our identity, or our perceived position within a group hierarchy.
Hierarchy is a big deal for humans, right?
Huge. Humans possess a very natural, deeply ingrained desire to organize the world into social hierarchies. It's how we make sense of our environment. But when someone infringes on our perceived place in that structure, we react aggressively and without thought.
This reminds me of extreme road rage.
Oh, perfect example.
Right, because somebody cuts you off in traffic and suddenly your blood is boiling. Objectively, it might have delayed you by like 2 seconds, and the physical danger has already passed. But the fury isn't about safety. It's about the indignity of it. It's the internal monologue screaming, "Who do you think you are to cut me off?"
The road rage scenario perfectly isolates the ego default. On the highway, we are all ostensibly equals playing by the exact same set of rules. When someone cuts you off, their action implicitly signals that their time is more valuable than yours, placing them higher in the social hierarchy.
And we just can't stand that.
No, your ego, which is designed to protect your status for survival, simply will not tolerate that demotion. But while road rage is obvious, where the ego default becomes truly insidious is in how it interacts with information and knowledge.
How so?
Our behavioral sources point out the extreme, often catastrophic danger of what they call unearned knowledge.
Unearned knowledge. I'm picturing someone reading a single sensationalized headline and suddenly deciding they're an elite geopolitical expert ready to debate foreign policy on the internet.
That is the exact manifestation. The ego default eagerly takes a tiny fragment of shallow information, perhaps a summary of an article or a 5-minute video, and magically alchemizes it into reckless, arrogant confidence.
Because true confidence takes time.
Exactly. True, reliable confidence is the byproduct of a long track record of applying deep knowledge successfully and learning from failures. But unearned knowledge rushes us straight to absolute certainty.
Which feels great in the moment.
It feels powerful. When the ego is armed with a little bit of information, we convince ourselves we have the entire complex system figured out. We begin to assume that low probability risks are zero probability risks.
We feel immune.
We feel entirely immune to bad luck. And worst of all, the ego forces us to mistake how we want the world to operate with how the world actually operates.
So as a practical diagnostic tool, if I find myself in a meeting, spending an immense amount of energy and oxygen, aggressively trying to prove that my initial idea is right, or if I get wildly defensive the second someone points out a minor logical flaw in my plan, that is the ego default taking the wheel.
100%.
I'm no longer interested in protecting the objective truth or finding the best outcome for the company. I am solely interested in protecting my fragile self-image.
That is the crucial distinction. You become detached from actual outcomes and completely obsessed with self-preservation. You would rather drive the company off a cliff than admit your map was upside down.
Wow.
And the need to protect your status within a group naturally leads us to the third biological trap, which is the social default.
The overwhelming pressure to conform. I feel like this invisible gravity dictates almost everything we do, from the clothes we buy to the corporate jargon we use.
The gravity of the crowd is immense. The social default is our hardwired instinct for conformity. It coaxes us to adopt a belief, support a strategy, or fall in line with a behavior simply because the people around us are doing it.
Just going with the flow.
Right. And it is driven by a very primal, deeply rooted fear of being the outsider. We fear being scorned, we fear standing out, and we fear disappointing the collective.
Because back on the savannah.
Exactly. Look at the evolutionary mechanism. In prehistoric times, being exiled from the safety of the tribe meant almost certain death by exposure or predation. Therefore, conforming unquestioningly to the tribe's behavior literally kept you alive.
But the paradox is that in the modern world, conforming doesn't keep you alive. It just guarantees that you remain entirely average.
That is the brutal mathematical truth of conformity. If you consistently do exactly what everyone else does, you are statistically guaranteed to achieve the exact same average results that everyone else achieves.
That makes total sense.
In the corporate world, we love to champion best practices. But by definition, a widely adopted best practice is just the average way of doing things. It guarantees mediocrity.
This connects beautifully to a quote from the baseball legend Lou Brock that was highlighted in our sports psychology sources. He famously said, "Show me a guy who's afraid to look bad, and I'll show you a guy you can beat every time."
The psychological insight in that quote is profound. An individual or a company entirely possessed by the social default is incredibly easy to defeat in a competitive environment.
Why is that?
Because they will never, ever take the uncomfortable, unconventional risks required to achieve extraordinary asymmetric results. Thinking clearly and strategically often means thinking independently, and breaking free of the social default is guaranteed to cause acute psychological discomfort.
Yeah, nobody likes being the weirdo in the room.
Exactly. If you are constantly biting your tongue in brainstorming sessions just to ensure you fit in with the consensus, the social default is dictating your career trajectory.
Okay, so we've mapped out 3 formidable traps. The motion default blinding us, the ego default protecting our fragile status, and the social default forcing us into mediocrity. What is the 4th biological mechanism?
The final trap is the inertia default. This is our deep-seated systemic desire to maintain the status quo. Humans are fundamentally habit-forming, comfort-seeking organisms. We are biologically programmed to conserve energy whenever possible.
It's the psychological equivalent of Newton's first law of motion, right?
Yeah.
Like an object at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force.
The physics analogy applies flawlessly to human behavior. Maintaining the current state of affairs, no matter how suboptimal it is, requires almost zero cognitive or physical effort.
It's easy.
It's very easy. Building new momentum and changing direction takes immense caloric energy and mental strain. But maintaining the current path takes very little. As a result, we slip into profound complacency.
We just sort of drift.
Exactly. Once a situation, a job, or a relationship becomes good enough, we stop trying to optimize it. We stop innovating, even if our old techniques are demonstrably failing. We actively resist change, even when we consciously know the proposed change would be highly beneficial in the long run.
You know, I see the inertia default ruin lives most clearly when it comes to difficult conversations.
Oh, yes.
Like we avoid sitting down and having that incredibly hard talk with an underperforming employee or a frustrated romantic partner because in the immediate moment, avoiding the conflict is deeply comfortable. It requires zero energy.
Right.
But by surrendering to that inertia default, aren't we just borrowing massive amounts of trouble against the future?
You are essentially taking out a high-interest loan on your future misery. The longer you avoid a necessary but difficult action, the exponentially harder it becomes to execute.
It just festers.
It does. What begins as avoiding a small, slightly awkward 10-minute conversation quietly ferments in the dark. It mutates into a massive, structurally sound, seemingly impossible conflict. The sheer weight of the unspoken issues eventually crushes the foundation of the relationship or the business. Inertia keeps us repeatedly doing things that we know do not get us what we want, and it operates almost completely in our subconscious background.
Let me just pause and synthesize this, because the implications are massive. It is as if our brains are running a severely outdated, unpatched operating system.
Exactly.
Evolution programmed us flawlessly for the African savanna, preserving our physical energy through inertia, fighting violently against threats to our ego and status, conforming blindly to the tribe, and letting fear dictate our emotions. Like, these things successfully kept our ancestors alive long enough to reproduce.
They worked perfectly back then.
Right. But today, we are running that exact same Savannah software in a sleek, glass-walled corporate boardroom, or inside the complex dynamics of a modern marriage. And that software is actively, systematically destroying our lives.
The Savannah software in the modern skyscraper is the perfect encapsulation of the human condition. And understanding this biological mismatch explains one of the greatest mysteries of life.
Which is?
Why highly successful, incredibly intelligent people constantly make seemingly idiotic, self-destructive mistakes. When a brilliant CEO torpedoes their company in a fit of rage, or a genius engineer refuses to update a failing design out of stubborn pride, they aren't lacking intelligence. They are simply surrendering control to their biology.
But wait, this brings up an interesting contradiction. Because the people who are truly exceptional, the ones who seem to navigate high-stakes environments with incredible grace and master their lives, they don't just magically lack an ego, do they? Like they haven't had their amygdala surgically removed, they aren't robots devoid of emotion?
Not at all. The individuals who master their decision-making experience the exact same intense biological urges that you and I do. They feel the sudden, hot flash of anger. They feel the sharp sting of a bruised ego when criticized.
They still feel all of it.
They feel the intense, suffocating pressure to conform to the room, and they feel the heavy gravitational pull of laziness and inertia. The critical difference is not the absence of the defaults. The difference is their response.
Okay, so what do they do differently?
They don't magically eliminate these biological programs. Instead, they have learned to recognize the specific internal signals when these defaults are attempting to take the wheel, and they actively force a pause. They engineer a gap between the external stimulus and their internal response.
See, this is the turning point where the theory hits reality. Because creating that gap, actually hitting the pause button when your brain chemistry is aggressively screaming at you to attack the threat or run away, it feels practically impossible in the heat of the moment. It's like trying to stop a moving freight train with your bare hands.
It really is. So how do we systematically accomplish this? If brute forcing our way through life using sheer white-knuckled willpower is doomed to fail against millions of years of evolutionary momentum, how do we actually outsmart our own instincts?
You outsmart biology by understanding that willpower is a finite, unreliable resource. If biology is your internal enemy, then environment and structure must be your external saviors.
Environment and structure.
Yes. This brings us to the foundational concept of positioning. The strategy is not to fight the defaults at their peak power. The strategy is to meticulously set up your life, your schedule, and your environment so that your defaults simply do not get triggered in the first place.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
And if they do get triggered, you have engineered a massive structural buffer to absorb the impact.
Positioning. I love the strategic sound of that. How do we conceptualize positioning in our daily lives?
To visualize positioning, think about the classic video game Tetris.
Oh man, I am almost embarrassed to admit how many hours of my life I have surrendered to Tetris. I know it well. Then you know intimately how the mechanics of that game mimic the mechanics of life. When you are playing Tetris well, your board is flat, organized, and even. You are in what we would call a good position.
Right.
And because your foundation is solid, almost any piece the game's random number generator hands you can be utilized to your advantage. You aren't stressed because you have dozens of viable options for where to place the next block.
That's the flow state. Everything just clicks into place. But when you're playing poorly and the screen is filled up with those jagged, chaotic towers of blocks creeping toward the top of the screen, the entire emotional experience of the game changes.
Exactly the shift we are talking about. That chaotic board is a bad position. And when you are in a bad position, your options evaporate. You are no longer playing strategically. You are desperately praying for one specific, perfect piece.
The long, straight 4-block piece.
Yes. You need that one piece just to clear line and survive for another 10 seconds. When you are poorly positioned, your circumstances force you to make desperate, reactive decisions. You are completely at the mercy of whatever the environment throws at you.
That is a phenomenal lens through which to view decision-making. Because when you are well positioned, time is your greatest ally. You can wait for the right opportunity. But when you are poorly positioned, time is your absolute worst enemy. The clock is ticking down to your destruction.
This dynamic applies to literally every domain of human endeavor. Consider corporate strategy. A company that has spent years carefully building up a massive cash reserve, keeping its overhead low, and holding very little debt is in a fantastic position.
They have a flat Tetris board.
Exactly. When the inevitable macroeconomic crash occurs, that well-positioned company does not panic. They do not trigger their emotion or ego defaults. In fact, time is their friend. They have incredible options. They can acquire their struggling competitors for pennies on the dollar. They can aggressively invest in research and development while others are cutting budgets. Or they can hire top-tier talent that just got laid off.
But look at the inverse. A company that maximized its debt to fuel aggressive short-term growth to appease shareholders. When that same economic crash hits, their position is terrible.
They have zero good options.
Right. They can't innovate. They are just frantically bailing water, praying for a government bailout or a miraculous market turnaround. They are desperately waiting for that long, straight Tetris piece to save them.
And this isn't just about corporate balance sheets. It applies to your personal finances, your physical health, and your emotional bandwidth. So the primary objective is clear. How do we maintain a good position?
Right. How do we build that psychological and emotional fortress so we aren't constantly forced into bad choices by our biological defaults?
The answer lies in building systemic safeguards. And one of the most effective, battle-tested behavioral safeguards we found in the literature originates from the addiction recovery community, specifically Alcoholics Anonymous. It is known as the HLT rule. H-A-L-T.
HLT. What does it stand for?
It stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired.
I've heard variations of this, but applying it to high-level decision-making makes perfect sense. The rule is that you never make a consequential decision when you are experiencing any of those 4 states.
The physiology behind the HL2 rule is rock solid. If you are hungry, your brain is literally depleted of the glucose required for complex executive function. If you are tired, your prefrontal cortex is operating at a fraction of its capacity.
You're just running on fumes.
Right. In these states, your emotion default has already bypassed your rational mind. You simply do not have the biological currency required to think clearly. You are biologically compromised.
So if it is 11:30 p.m., I am exhausted from a long flight, and I open an infuriating email from a client demanding an explanation for a delay. The instinct is to fire off a defensive, ego-driven response immediately.
That's the default talking.
But the HALT rule dictates that I am in a terrible position. I am tired and angry. I have to step away from the keyboard and go to sleep.
By walking away, you are manufacturing space. You are deferring the decision until the next morning when you are rested, fed, and back in a good position. Your response at 9:30 a.m. will be strategic, whereas your response at 11:30 p.m. would have been purely biological.
That makes total sense.
But simple heuristic rules like HALT are just the outer wall of the fortress. To truly maintain a good position over a lifetime, our sources indicate you must cultivate 4 specific internal strengths to actively combat the 4 biological defaults.
Let's break down that internal architecture. What are the 4 strengths?
The first pillar is self-accountability. This is the conscious practice of holding yourself entirely responsible for developing your abilities, managing your personal flaws, and using reason to govern your actions. It is the absolute refusal to play the victim or blame your circumstances.
Okay, taking full ownership.
Exactly. The second pillar is self-knowledge. This requires a level of brutal, uncomfortable honesty about what you are actually capable of, and perhaps more importantly, what you are fundamentally not capable of. It is the ongoing mapping of your own cognitive blind spots.
Knowing where you're weak.
Yes. The third pillar is self-control. This is the disciplined mastery over your fears, your fleeting desires, and your emotional impulses.
Those 3 make intuitive sense. Accountability, knowledge, control. What is the 4th strength?
The 4th is self-confidence. But we must define this in a very specific, unconventional way based on the psychological literature.
Unconventional how?
Well, in this context, true self-confidence has absolutely nothing to do with walking into a room and assuming you're the smartest person there. In fact, that is arrogance, which is a symptom of the ego default. True self-confidence is defined as the deeply held ability to focus entirely on what is right rather than who is right.
Oh, wow. That is a phenomenal reframing. Because if you lack that specific type of self-confidence, your ego default flares up at the slightest challenge. You care desperately about proving that your idea is the correct one because your identity is tied to the idea.
Exactly.
But if you possess true self-confidence, you genuinely do not care where the correct answer originates, whether it comes from you, a junior intern, or a rival, as long as the team achieves the optimal outcome.
The mechanism there is cognitive detachment. You successfully detach your personal identity from the proposed idea. You view ideas objectively. However, cultivating these 4 strengths, accountability, knowledge, control, and true confidence, is remarkably difficult to do in a vacuum.
So how do we actually build them?
Our cognitive sources suggest a brilliant, actionable technique for developing these traits. It's constructing a personal board of directors.
I am intrigued. Are we talking about an imaginary boardroom inside my head?
Yes, essentially a psychological simulation. You curate a mental board composed of exemplars people you deeply admire, whether they are living mentors, deceased historical figures, or even fictional characters who perfectly embody the traits you wish to cultivate.
Okay, so I could pick, like, anyone.
Anyone. You might select Marcus Aurelius for his stoic emotional control, a former boss for her brilliant strategic foresight, and perhaps Warren Buffett for his patience. When you face an acute crisis, instead of immediately reacting with your biological defaults, you hit pause and run a mental simulation. You ask yourself, how would my board of directors analyze and respond to this specific threat?
I can totally see the utility in that. It taps into the psychological concept of self-distancing. Right?
Exactly right.
It forcefully removes you from the center of your own emotional storm and forces you to view the chaotic problem through the calm, objective lens of someone you respect. It creates an artificial gap.
Yes, it manufactures space.
But I have to play devil's advocate here because this sounds wonderful in theory. It is incredibly easy for us to sit here in a quiet studio and calmly state, just take a pause, channel the stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, and make sure your glucose levels are optimal.
Sure, sounds easy now.
Right. But what about the reality of the modern workplace? What happens when the pressure is immense and instantaneous? Picture a high-stakes crisis where millions of dollars are evaporating, the servers just crashed, your boss is visibly panicking, and a room full of 20 people is staring at you in dead silence, waiting for you to lead.
A real nightmare scenario.
Yeah, you cannot realistically hold up a hand and say, "Hold on, everyone, I need to consult my imaginary historical board of directors."
You are highlighting the exact breaking point where theoretical psychology often fails in practice. And our sources, specifically drawing heavily from the executive coaching frameworks developed by experts like Vivek Singh for managing extreme high-pressure scenarios, address this precise reality.
Okay, what's the solution there?
His core insight is this. When the pressure is immense and immediate, you absolutely cannot invent space on the spot. If the space isn't already there, biology wins. Therefore, you must have engineered that space before the crisis ever materializes.
How do you do that?
The first step in his framework is that you must map your emotional resilience threshold during times of peace.
Meaning, you need a highly accurate gauge of exactly how much stress, fatigue, and conflict you can absorb before your prefrontal cortex shuts down and your amygdala takes over.
Exactly that. You must calibrate your emotional grounding by intentionally testing your limits in low-stakes environments and by seeking out unvarnished, honest feedback from trusted peers regarding how your behavior degrades under stress.
So you know your own warning signs.
Yes. If you intimately know the warning signs of your own breaking point, maybe your breathing gets shallow, or you start speaking faster, or you get intensely sarcastic, you can feel the threshold approaching during the crisis and take preemptive action before you actually snap.
That makes sense.
But beyond self-knowledge, the most critical, actionable strategy in that high-pressure, terrifying boardroom moment is the psychological tactic of cognitive reappraisal. It is entirely about how you frame the incoming data.
Reappraisal.
Yeah.
How do we practically reframe a server meltdown that might cost us our jobs?
You must consciously and forcefully reframe the intense pressure from a threat into a challenge. Consider the physiological mechanism. If your brain perceives the room's panic as a threat, it dumps cortisol into your system, triggering the ego and emotion defaults. You go into a defensive crouch.
Right.
But if you use your executive function to cognitively label the exact same situation as a challenge, you instantly alter the chemical dynamic in your brain. You shift out of survival mode and into problem-solving mode. You replace the paralyzing fear with a surge of focused energy.
So instead of the internal monologue screaming, "We are losing millions, the board is going to fire me, I am in danger," you literally force your internal monologue to state, "This is a highly complex, incredibly difficult puzzle, and coordinating this team to solve it is going to be exceptionally satisfying."
Yes. You are tricking your own neurochemistry.
Wow.
You are overriding the default programming. And Singh highlights one final crucial element for navigating these crises: the deployment of radical self-compassion.
Self-compassion in a crisis.
Absolutely. High-performing individuals naturally set impossibly high, often perfectionist standards for themselves. In the middle of an unprecedented crisis, you have to rationally recognize that you do not need, and realistically cannot have, an immediate, flawless solution for every single cascading problem the second it arises.
That's a lot of pressure to take off your own shoulders.
It is. Acknowledging that intense pressure and uncertainty are simply inherent parts of leadership, and treating yourself with a measure of grace rather than brutal self-criticism isn't a sign of weakness. It is a tactical maneuver.
Lowering the internal pressure.
Exactly. Lowering the internal pressure gives your brain the necessary emotional oxygen to step back, survey the board, and actually think clearly.
That connects the dots beautifully. So we now have the defensive playbook. We understand how to identify our ancient biological defaults. We have learned how to use positioning, the HALT rule, and our internal board of directors to create space. And we know how to use cognitive reappraisal to survive high-pressure moments without regressing to Savannah logic.
We aren't forced into panic reactions anymore.
But this naturally begs the next question. Once I have successfully carved out that quiet space between the stimulus and my response, I still have to actually make a decision. Having the space to think doesn't automatically mean the thought will be brilliant. How do we ensure the choices we make inside that hard-won space are actually effective?
Now we transition from defense to offense. We are moving from the mechanics of stopping a bad reaction to the architecture of executing a brilliant strategy. And according to the cognitive frameworks we are examining, the absolute most critical step in making any strategic decision is a step that the vast majority of intelligent people completely skip over.
Okay, don't keep me in suspense. What is the skip step?
It is the rigorous discipline of getting the problem right. It is defining the actual problem accurately before you ever attempt a solution. The human brain loves to solve puzzles, so we instinctively rush to apply bandages to surface-level symptoms without ever diagnosing the underlying disease.
We just want to fix it.
Exactly. But to find the structural root cause of any issue, you must train yourself to ask one very specific, penetrating question. What would need to be true for this problem not to exist in the first place?
What would need to be true for this problem not to exist? That is a fascinating mental pivot. It forces you to look beneath the floorboards. Instead of asking how to extinguish the fire in the kitchen, you're asking what systemic flaws allowed the fire to ignite at all.
Consider a classic business example. A company notices their customer churn rate is skyrocketing. The immediate reactionary instinct driven by the urge to just do something is to throw money at the symptom.
Right, they panic.
They launch a massive marketing campaign, they offer steep discount codes to retain users, they just react. But if they pause and ask, what would need to be true for this churn problem not to exist? They might realize the core truth. Their core product simply hasn't been updated in 2 years and is no longer competitive. The marketing campaign was a massive waste of capital solving the wrong problem.
That makes perfect sense. So once you have accurately diagnosed the true underlying problem, you need to explore potential solutions. But how do we evaluate those solutions without letting our ego or inertia defaults quietly blind us to the risks?
To bypass those defaults, you need specialized cognitive tools. One of the most powerful problem-solving tools highlighted in our sources is the concept of inversion. It is a technique popularized by elite investors and mathematicians.
Inversion. So like breaking down a problem by analyzing its opposite.
Precisely the mechanism. The standard approach to a goal is forward thinking. You ask, how do we make this upcoming product launch a massive historic success? But that forward-thinking approach is highly vulnerable to the planning fallacy and the ego default. We naturally assume everything will go right.
We're overly optimistic.
We are. Inversion flips the perspective. Instead of planning for success, you intentionally plan for catastrophe. You ask the team, what would be the absolute worst decisions we could possibly make right now? What actions would guarantee that this launch fails spectacularly? You build an exhaustive list of all the ways to fail, and then your primary strategy simply becomes avoid doing those specific things at all costs.
You know, this sounds very similar to a corporate exercise I've seen called the pre-mortem.
The pre-mortem is the most practical, brilliant application of inversion in a group setting. In a standard post-mortem, a project has already failed, and everyone sits around a table defensively trying to shift the blame to avoid looking bad.
Yeah, nobody wants to hold the bag.
The ego default ruins the analysis. But in a pre-mortem, you conduct the autopsy before the patient is dead. You gather your team and declare, imagine it is 6 months in the future. The product we are launching today has failed completely and disastrously. It is a catastrophic embarrassment. Now, working backward from that known failure, tell me exactly what went wrong. Why did it fail?
That is a phenomenal cognitive hack. Because if you just ask a team, hey, does anyone see any risks before a big launch? Nobody wants to be the negative outlier. The social default kicks in. They don't want to ruin the optimistic vibe of the room or look like they aren't team players. But if the leader mandates that the project has already failed in this hypothetical exercise, you completely remove the social stigma. You actually give everyone explicit permission and reward them for pointing out all the structural flaws and hidden risks they've been secretly anxious about.
You are successfully hacking their group psychology to extract the unvarnished truth. But we must be warned. Even with sophisticated tools like inversion and pre-mortems, we possess a massive inherent vulnerability when it comes to evaluating our own decision-making prowess over time.
What's the vulnerability?
It stems from a startling, somewhat disturbing psychological reality. Our brains actively, continuously, and seamlessly edit our memories to make us look significantly smarter and more capable than we actually are.
Oh, surely we aren't that delusional. I like to think I have a pretty accurate memory of why I made certain choices in the past.
Well, the psychological literature on hindsight bias suggests you almost certainly do not. It's true. Hindsight bias is a remarkably powerful biological editing suite. When we make a complex decision under uncertainty, and it happens to succeed, our brain immediately rewrites the historical narrative. The new memory insists, I am a strategic genius. I saw the hidden angles. I predicted this exact outcome.
When it fails.
When we make a decision and it fails miserably, our brain quietly edits the story in the opposite direction, telling us, my logic was flawless. I did everything perfectly. I was just the victim of unforeseeable bad luck or an unprecedented market shift. We almost never admit to ourselves that our initial thinking was simply lazy or flawed.
We enthusiastically privatize the gains and socialize the losses within our own minds.
Exactly.
We take full credit for the wins and blame the universe for the losses. But if our brains are constantly seamlessly lying to us about our own historical track record, how is it mathematically possible to ever learn from our mistakes and improve our judgment?
You cannot rely on your memory. You must force yourself to face the unedited, raw truth of your cognition. And the most effective mechanism for doing this is maintaining a formal decision journal.
A journal, like a diary specifically for my choices.
Essentially, yes, but highly structured. Whenever you are faced with a consequential decision, hiring a key executive, making a major investment, moving to a new city, before you take action, you open the journal and write it down.
What exactly am I writing?
You record the exact context of the situation. You list the complex variables at play. You document the alternative paths you seriously considered and precisely why you rejected them. You write down exactly what you expect to happen, and you force yourself to assign hard mathematical probabilities to those outcomes.
That's detailed.
And crucially, you document your internal environment, your physical and emotional state. Are you fatigued? Are you feeling pressured by a deadline? You document your HLT state.
That sounds incredibly rigorous. It requires a lot of activation energy.
It is rigorous, but it is the only way to bypass the brain's editing software. Because 6 months or a year later, when the outcome of that decision is undeniably known, you go back and open that journal, you read the entry, and in that moment, you come face to face with the exact person you were when you made the choice.
Wow.
There is no corporate jargon to hide behind. There is no revisionist history. You cannot claim that you knew it would fail all along. If your own handwriting states you gave it a 90% probability of success. The decision journal acts as an unforgiving mirror. It shows you the raw state of your thinking before your ego default had a chance to polish the memory.
I can easily see how reading that journal would be incredibly humbling. It would forcefully strip away your arrogance, but I also see how it is the fastest, most effective way to identify the recurring patterns in your own bad judgment.
It's a powerful tool.
So we utilize the decision journal to keep our egos radically honest in the long term. But what about managing the overwhelming chaos of our daily, hourly actions? Do our sources provide a framework for that?
Yes. For leaders, executives, and frankly, anyone trying to navigate highly complex, fast-moving environments, our sources outline a remarkably effective operational protocol known as the STABB framework. STABB.
Okay, STABB. What does it stand for?
It stands for Space to Think, Act to Execute, Set Boundaries, and Broadcast Actions.
Let's pull that framework apart and see how it actually functions on a practical Tuesday morning. Walk me through it.
The STABB framework is designed to be utilized as a daily, weekly, and quarterly rhythm. The first component, space to think, requires deliberately scheduling unstructured time into your calendar, perhaps just 15 or 30 minutes a day, aggressively defended from meetings.
To do what?
In this space, you elevate above the tactical noise and look at the strategic big picture. You ask the clarifying question. What is the single most important objective for us right now, and what mundane tasks are we currently doing that are actively preventing us from accomplishing it?
So you are intentionally, forcefully stepping out of the day-to-day reactionary grind to ensure you are actually climbing the correct mountain rather than just climbing efficiently.
Exactly. You are breaking the inertia default. The second step, act, involves executing decisions strategically, which means evaluating your options based entirely on second and third order consequences.
Right.
This is a massive differentiator in clear thinking. It requires the maturity to accept acute short-term pain in exchange for massive long-term gain. When considering an action, you don't just ask the amateur question, what happens if I do this? You train yourself to relentlessly ask, and then what happens?
Right. You are mapping out the cascading domino effects of the choice. It reminds me of the concept of technical debt in software engineering. You can write a quick, messy piece of code to launch a feature today. That's the first order consequence. You get the launch.
Exactly.
But the second order consequence is that the code breaks next month. And the third order consequence is that your best engineers quit because they are exhausted from fixing broken code.
That is a flawless illustration of third order thinking. Moving to the next letter, boundaries is the practice of radical, ruthless prioritization. It is the understanding that time is zero-sum. Every time you say yes to a minor request, you are implicitly saying no to a major priority.
It's about saying no.
Yes, setting boundaries requires looking at your strategy and asking, what must I absolutely stop doing today? Finally, broadcast means clearly, consistently, and transparently communicating your goals, your rationale, and your boundaries to all your stakeholders, ensuring the entire ecosystem is aligned.
I love the structure of Step B, but I need to pause and ask a deeply practical question regarding this entire methodology. Between maintaining a rigorous decision journal where I'm documenting every variable and biological state, running pre-mortems for every project, mapping out third-order consequences, and consulting a mental board of directors, doesn't this entirely rigid process lead straight into crippling analysis paralysis?
That's a fair question.
Like in the real world, at what precise point do you stop gathering data, stop filling out cognitive templates, and just take action?
That is the most vital caveat to all of this. Clear thinking is absolutely not synonymous with endless pondering. In fact, endless pondering is often just the inertia default, wearing a clever disguise.
Oh, that's tricky.
According to the strategic frameworks, you must stop gathering information and execute the moment one of three conditions is met. First, when the new information you are acquiring is no longer shifting your probabilities, but simply confirming what you already know.
Okay, redundant info.
Second, when the time spent waiting for more perfect information means you risk losing the strategic window of opportunity entirely. Or third, when the optimal choice simply becomes obvious.
So the goal is never a 100% perfect, risk-free solution.
A perfect, risk-free solution is a dangerous illusion. You do not need the perfect choice. You merely need to effectively eliminate the worst possible options, select the most mathematically favorable path, and aggressively move forward.
How do you judge how fast to move, though?
Our behavioral economics sources offer a fantastic, simple heuristic for navigating this balance. You evaluate the speed of your decisions based on two metrics: consequence and reversibility.
Consequence and reversibility. How does that matrix work in practice?
It is brilliantly simple. If a decision has low consequences and is highly reversible, meaning if you're completely wrong, the financial or reputational damage is minimal and you can easily undo the action, you should make that decision as fast as humanly possible.
Do it.
Do not waste a second of cognitive energy. Do not write in your decision journal about what color to paint the corporate break room or which catering company to use for Friday lunch. Just pick one and execute.
The classic Silicon Valley mantra: move fast and break things. But only if the things you are breaking are cheap and easy to glue back together.
Precisely. However, if a decision has massive structural consequences and extremely low reversibility, like acquiring a major rival company, taking a company public, or getting a highly visible tattoo on your face, you must make that decision as slowly and deliberately as possible.
That's when you slow down.
You deploy every tool: the decision journal, the pre-mortem, the board of directors. You painstakingly gather information right up until the last responsible moment before taking the leap.
Okay, so let's pull all of these threads together. What does this all mean for the listener? We have thoroughly mapped out the primitive biological default, emotion, ego, social, and inertia that actively try to ruin our lives. We have explored how to use positioning and the HLT rule to build a defensive fortress against our own biology.
We covered a lot of ground.
And we've walked through the heavy cognitive machinery of inversion, decision journals, and the STABI-B framework to execute brilliant strategic choices. We know how to start making stupid, impulsive mistakes, and we know how to think clearly. But sitting here looking at all of this, it feels like there's one massive foundational piece missing from the puzzle.
There is a missing piece, and it represents the ultimate final question of human existence. Because all the clear thinking frameworks, all the rational decision journals, and all the emotional control in the universe are completely, tragically useless if they are applied toward the wrong end goals.
Exactly.
You can perfectly execute a brilliant 10-year strategy to efficiently climb a ladder, but if you reach the top only to realize that ladder was leaning against the wrong wall, your life is still a failure.
Yes. This is the existential dilemma. How do we actually know what is worth wanting? Because my biological ego default is screaming at me that I want absolute power and unassailable status. My social default is telling me I desperately want a nicer, more expensive car than my neighbor. If our biology is constantly feeding us corrupted desires, how do we bypass that programming to find what actually matters?
To answer that profoundly difficult question, we must look at the end of the journey. Our sources reference the fascinating, deeply moving work of gerontologist Karl Pillemer. He conducted exhaustive qualitative interviews with thousands of elderly Americans, asking them to deeply reflect on the totality of their lives.
What was he looking for?
He was searching for the ultimate signal in the noise. He wanted to know what they truly valued in hindsight and what haunted them as regrets. And the aggregate results serve as a staggering, profound reality check against our biological defaults.
What were the findings? What did they say when they look back?
Let's begin with what they explicitly did not value. Out of thousands of interviews, practically not a single person at the end of their life said that to be happy, they wished they had worked longer hours to accumulate more wealth.
That's incredible.
No one said they felt fulfilled because they were financially wealthier than the people living next door to them. No one advised the younger generation to choose their life's work based purely on its maximum earning potential or social prestige. And perhaps most tellingly, not a single person said they regretted failing to get revenge on a coworker or rival who had slighted them decades ago.
That is a staggering realization. Because if you pause and look at that list of things nobody cared about on their deathbed, relentless accumulation of money, comparative social status, petty revenge, those are the exact specific things that our ego and social defaults scream at us to aggressively pursue every single day of our working lives.
AR.
The prehistoric biology that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah is actively, relentlessly pushing us toward a modern life of hollow regret.
It is the ultimate tragic irony of the human condition. Our survival software is optimizing for misery. But Pillemer's research also uncovered the profound truths of what they did value.
Which is what?
The elders urgently advise people to say the things they feel now to the people they care about, to express deep gratitude, to ask for necessary forgiveness, and to never wait for a better time. They heavily emphasize the practice of savoring small, daily, ordinary pleasures rather than suspending their happiness while waiting for massive, big-ticket events like a promotion or retirement.
Savoring the present.
Yes. They advise choosing a life partner with extreme, deliberate care. And above all else, the universal consensus was to spend the maximum possible amount of time with your children and loved ones.
You know, when you strip away the biological noise, it all distills down to genuine human connection. It's about being fully present in the ordinary moments rather than being possessed by the anxiety of the future or the grievances of the past.
The focus on the present is the key. Because do you know what Pillemer discovered was their single most pervasive, agonizing regret?
I am almost afraid to ask, what was it?
It was worrying. Their greatest collective regret was wasting years of their precious, sharply limited lives worrying intensely about terrible things that never actually happened.
Wow, that strikes a very deep chord. Because if you analyze it through the lens of everything we've discussed today, the biological defaults are all fundamentally fear-based engines.
Completely.
The emotion default fears immediate physical threats. The ego default fears a catastrophic loss of status. The social default fears the isolation of ostracization. The inertia default fears the unpredictable nature of the unknown. Our evolutionary biology is, at its core, a magnificent, tireless worry machine.
That's exactly what it is.
And the cognitive tools we've explored today, the clear thinking, the positioning, the intentional space, that is the only arsenal we possess to override that worry machine and consciously choose the things that bring genuine, lasting joy.
That realization is the very essence of this entire deep dive. The data clearly shows that we regret the things we did not do far more intensely than the mistakes we actively made. The psychological pain of trying something difficult, taking a risk, and failing is certainly sharp in the moment, but it metabolizes and fades surprisingly quickly.
You bounce back.
You learn, you update your mental models, and you move forward. But the pain of failing to try, the dull, chronic, aching regret of letting your biological defaults keep you safely, comfortably paralyzed in the inertia default, that specific type of pain never really dissipates, it haunts you.
So we're leaving you with a final thought to mull over, and it's a bit of a departure from biology. We are rapidly moving into an era of artificial intelligence, an era where machines, completely devoid of amygdalas, egos, or social fears, will increasingly make massive, perfectly rational decisions.
A frictionless world.
Right? These systems don't suffer from the defaults. They just calculate. In a future dominated by that kind of alien, frictionless logic, our flawed, messy, emotional biology might be the only thing that actually makes us uniquely human. The question is no longer just how to survive our biology, but whether we will let it blindly enslave us, or whether we will master it to design a life that a perfectly rational machine could never understand.
That's a beautiful way to frame it.
If this were your final year of life, would you be fighting the same petty battles, avoiding the same hard conversations, and chasing the same hollow status symbols? And if the answer is no, what ordinary moment are you going to change tomorrow?
It's all about tomorrow.
Because remember that Wednesday afternoon meeting, the humming fluorescent lights, the passive-aggressive comment hanging in the air, and that microscopic gap between the insults and your reaction. You aren't just deciding what words to say next. You are deciding who is ultimately in charge of your destiny. A prehistoric algorithm running in your brain, or you. The choice is always yours, provided you create the space to make it.